Welcome. Are you having fun already? Thank you. Welcome to the Gala reading of the Humanities Montana Festival of the Book. It's a gathering of strong, eloquent women. I'm Ken Egan, Executive Director of Humanities Montana, and I'm proud to say that Humanities Montana believes in our state's future. That future depends on strong communities. We help build that future by connecting kids to community, supporting schools, libraries, and museums, and bringing Montanans together for deliberation and celebration. It seems to me that's what this festival is all about. We partner with these wonderful organizations, both here in Missoula and around the state, museums, libraries, schools. We have an opportunity to bring in kids and young adults for various programs during the festival. And of course, we bring all of you together for celebration. So thank you for being here. It's a wonderful thing for us. So you can help us continue this kind of work by donating to our cause. And I am going to ask that if you get a chance, go to humanitiesmontana.org and look at our various possibilities, our programs, our grants, and consider making a donation. And in the more immediate future, feel free to drop some money in the beautiful plastic box that you'll find out there in the lobby. Feel free to do that. We won't object to it, so please do that by all means. Speaking of gifts, I have to thank a number of terrific organizations that have provided the funding that allows this to happen, for you to be here tonight, for all of us to gather at the Holiday Inn and the Missoula Art Museum and the library. So thanks to the Montana Arts Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation, the Pleiades Foundation, Montana Public Radio, and the Missoulian. Please help me in thanking these various sponsors. You bet. And on the program, I hope you'll take a moment to just note the various people involved in planning this event. They're good citizens, good people, creative, funny, fun, and they've been extremely important to us for 12 years now, so please take note of them as well. And last but not least, thanks to the Humanities Montana staff who spent countless hours making all this seem so much simpler than it truly is. Thanks to Kim Anderson, Judy Klein, Samantha Dwyer, Ken Stoltz, Susan Carlson, Jason Neal, Leah McElhenney, and all the volunteers. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. And now please help me in welcoming Deborah Franson, who's a field representative for Senator Jon Tester. Deborah.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to say a few words. I'd like to welcome all of you to Missoula, and for those of you from out of state, welcome to Montana. The tradition of Western literature runs deep in Montana, and I'm grateful to live in a state that recognizes and values the writers whose work enhances our lives. The annual Montana Festival of the Book reminds me of the many writers from the West who've enriched our literary world with beautiful poetry and prose about the land we love. I hope you enjoyed your festival. Please stay in touch. Sincerely, Senator Jon Tester. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Senator Tester. Good evening, I'm William Marcus. I serve as the chair of Humanities Montana. We have 19 members across Montana. We meet 3 times a year. And among other business, we consider grant applications. And ultimately this year, we will award $160,000 to nonprofit and educational organizations in Montana to do the work that Ken Egan described earlier. The Humanities Montana Festival of the Book is one of our signature events, and on behalf of the Board of Directors of Humanities Montana, I want to thank the Humanities Montana staff, and especially Kim Anderson, for all their excellent work. Each festival culminates like this, with us gathered in a darkened theater, listening to an author read aloud from their work. It's an all too rare opportunity anymore. We certainly have more access to stories than ever before with Kindles and Nooks and iPads and other communications devices. Speaking of those communications devices, those iPhones, those Androids, those Blackberries, those cell phones, would you please take yours out and turn it off? Or at least put it on vibrate. And we hope that your call comes at an especially interesting point in the story. I'd like to introduce Bonnie Jo Campbell. She grew up on a small Michigan farm with her mother and 4 siblings. When she left home for the University of Chicago to study philosophy, her mother rented out her room. She has since hitchhiked across the US and Canada, scaled the Swiss Alps on her bicycle, and traveled with the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, selling snow cones. As president of Goulash Tours Incorporated, she organized and led adventure tours in Russia and the Baltics, and all the way south to Romania and Bulgaria. She received her MA in mathematics and her MFA in writing from Western Michigan University. She now lives with her husband and other animals outside Kalamazoo, and she teaches writing in the Low Residency program at Pacific University. Her collection, Women and Other Animals, details the lives of extraordinary females in rural and small-town Michigan, and it won the Association of Writing Programs Prize for short fiction. Her story, The Smallest Man in the World, has been awarded a Pushcart Prize. Her novel, Q Road, investigates the lives of a rural community where development pressures are bringing unwelcome change in the character of the land. Her critically acclaimed short fiction collection, American Salvage, which consists of 14 lush and rowdy stories of folks who are struggling to make sense of the 21st century, was a finalist for the 2009 National Book Award in fiction. Oh, and she's also a 2001 Guggenheim Fellow. Alan Cheuse observed of American Savage, "What these people do to each other can't be washed away. But in these stories about cold, lonely, meth-drenched, modern, working-class, small-town Michigan life, there's a roughness and even beauty." Tonight, Bonnie will read from her novel, Once Upon a River. Though often compared to Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the novel is based on Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey. There is, however, one key difference. A man would have battles. A young woman would have relationships, Campbell observes. Jane Smiley has written in the New York Times Review of Books, "It would be too bad if, because of Campbell's realistic style and ferocious attention to her setting, Once Upon a River were discounted as merely a fine example of American regionalism. It is, rather, an excellent American parable about the consequences of our favorite ideal, freedom." Please welcome Bonnie Jo Campbell.
Thank you. It is so fabulous and great to be here. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, William, for that great introduction, and to Kim and Judy and everybody who's organized this event. It's so great and great energy, and those of you who have been at the panels, I'm overwhelmed with the need to discuss everything that I've been hearing, and but I guess I can't, because I can't even see you guys. It's all dark. You look like you're in the dark. So we'll meet afterwards. We'll talk about all of it. Is my distance okay? Because I'm getting like a reverb thing, but if I sound okay out there, that's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of my book, Once Upon a River. It has a nice boat on the cover. And as some of you heard me say today, I wanted to have a book cover so that men would buy it as well as women. So I thought, a nice rugged boat on there, does it? So I'm going to read from the beginning. And this is the story of a girl who has, as many of our favorite books deal with young people going out and having adventures, partially because of choices they make and partially because of what happens to them. So chapter 1. The Stark River flowed around the Oxbow at Murrayville the way blood flowed through Margot Crane's heart. She rode upstream to see wood ducks, canvasbacks, and ospreys, and to search for tiger salamanders in the ferns. She drifted downstream to find painted turtles sunning on fallen trees and to count the herons in the heronry beside the Murrayville Cemetery. She tied up her boat and followed shallow feeder streams to collect crayfish, watercress, and tiny wild strawberries. Her feet were toughened against sharp stones and even broken glass. When Margot swam, she swallowed minnows alive and felt the Stark River move inside her. She waded through serpentine tree roots to grab hold of water snakes and let the river clean the wounds from the non-venomous bites. She sometimes tricked a snapping turtle into clamping its jaws down hard on a branch so she could carry it home to Grandpa Murray. He boiled the meat to make soup and told the children that eating snapping turtle was like eating dinosaur. Margot was the only one the old man would take along when he fished or checked his animal traps, because she could sit without speaking for hours in the prow of the River Rose, his small teak boat. Margot learned that when she was tempted to speak or cry out, she should instead be still and watch and listen. The old man called her Sprite or River Nymph. Her cousins called her Nympho, though not usually within the old man's hearing. Margot, named Margaret Louise, and her cousins knew the muddy water and the brisk current, knew the sand and silt between their toes, scooped it into plastic cottage cheese tubs and sherbet buckets, and dribbled it through their fingers to build sagging stalagmites and soggy castles. They hollowed out the riverbanks, cut through soil and roots to create collapsing caves and tunnels. If any kid stood too long in a soft spot and sank above his knees, he only had to holler, and somebody pulled him free. They spent summers naked or nearly naked, harvesting night crawlers from the mossy woods and frogs' eggs from goo and underwater snags. They built rafts from driftwood and baling twine. They learned to read upon the surface of the water evidence of distress below. Once, when Margot was 8 and her favorite cousin Junior was 9, they rescued an uncle who'd fallen in drunk. They all fished the snags at the edges of the river for bluegills, sunfish, and rock bass, though they avoided the area just downstream of the Murray Metal Fabricating Plant, where a drain pipe released a mixture of wastewater, machine oil, and solvents into the river. Some of the fish there had strange tumors, bubbled flesh around their lips, a fraying at their gills. On certain windy days, the clay-colored smoke from the shop wafted along the river, reached them on their screen porches, and even when they closed their windows, the smoke entered their houses through floorboards and the gaps around doors. The Murrays were a stubborn tribe, and Bernard Crane was no less stubborn for being born the bastard son of Dorothy Crane and Old Man Murray during his bout of infidelity, forgiven in time by a wife who, despite or perhaps because of her forgiving nature, died young. The old man begged Dorothy Crane to give their child his last name, but she put on the birth certificate, father unknown. Some said Dorothy was part Indian and that was why Bernard was small. And others said that she had begrudged her baby sufficient milk at her breast because the old man would not leave his lawful wife, while others, including Cal Murray, denied that Bernard was in any way a Murray. Years later, however, when Bernard Crane, whom everyone called simply Crane, and his wife Luann gave birth to a beautiful green-eyed daughter, a spell of reconciliation was cast across the river, and all the Murrays claimed Margot. The girl's mother even enjoyed the favor of the other women for a while. More often, they referred to Luann as a free spirit. They did not mean it as a compliment. When the weather allowed, Margot and her cousins swam all day long. Even when drought made the river shallow enough to walk across, they swam to the Big Murray farmhouse on the north bank where Aunt Joanna was hanging laundry or baking bread, and where Uncle Cal might let them shoot skeet with shotguns or plink targets with .22 rifles. They swam straight across to the heavily shaded crane house, where Luann was often lying flat in a reclining chair at the end of the floating dock in the only sun on the place, wearing an unfastened bikini. Luann lay browning like one of Joanna's loaves of bread, lifting her head and opening her eyes only to drink the watered-down white wine she kept in a mason jar full of melting ice. Her scent of cocoa butter drifted out onto the water, and the boys could not take their eyes off her. In the evenings, Margot rowed, swam, or floated home, and her mother woke up, anticipated the girl's return, and stood, perhaps unsteadily, on the dock, holding a towel for Margot, her favorite towel, oversized with a pattern of jungle greens. Margot's teeth would chatter as her mother wrapped and hugged her. Only then would Margot smell the sweet breath of wine inside the cloud of cocoa butter. Luann would say, "Hold on, Margaret Louise," as they made their way in an embrace down the dock, along the bank, and into the house. They checked Margot for bloodsuckers on the screen porch and doused any stragglers with salt. After they had both showered, Luann might go to bed with her bottle of wine and watch TV, or begin her 12-hour sleep. But Margot curled on the couch and waited for her father to get home from the second shift at Murray Metal Fabricating, sometimes thumbing through her book about Annie Oakley, whose somber face she never tired of studying. Annie looked so natural with her rifles and shotguns, and it seemed to Margot that any girl would want a long gun at her side. When she said that to her ma, Luann had said tiredly that she didn't know how Annie Oakley could have fired so many times without killing anyone, without killing the whole damn lot of them. And Margot hadn't brought it up again. After a big storm or a sudden thaw, the river could become a passionate surge, dragging along debris from upstream, ill-secured boats or pieces of floats and docks that had been dashed against trees. All manner of stuff might be dragged up onto the riverbank. 55-gallon drums, mildewed buoys on nylon ropes, animal carcasses, and the floodwaters washed away what the Murrays had not secured or could not secure, sand from the sandbox, pig shit from the half-dozen pigs in the pasture, garden stakes and tomato cages left out from the previous summer, toys and dog dishes, thousands of shotgun shells and bullet casings from beside the barn. The yearly floods scrubbed the muskrat caves, drowned the moles, carried away burn barrels, wore away land, and swept clear portions of the earth. One February, after an early snowmelt, the cranes lost a whole cord of firewood that was stacked too close to the water's edge. The death of Margot's grandpa when she was 14 hit the whole family like one of those late winter floods, chilling everything, washing away that old generation and whatever invisible glue and strings had been holding the Murrays together. Margot had stayed by Grandpa's sickbed on the sun porch whenever they'd let her. After the funeral, she went out with Uncle Cal, loaded his lever-action .22 Marlin like Annie Oakley's with 15 long rifle cartridges, threaded her arm into the sling, and took aim through the iron sights. After her first shot went awry, Cal suggested she sit cross-legged and pull the sling tighter. The following 14 shots hit the paper target just left of center in a tight cluster. 12 of the shots created a single hole a little more than half an inch across. "What the hell was that?" Cal asked, running his finger over the torn paper. "I never shot like that in my life." That's unholy. Uncle Cal claimed credit for teaching her to shoot. But while Margot had felt his guidance, she had felt just as strongly the guidance of the gun itself. It held her steady, and then sadness perfected her aim. When Cal Murray took over as president of Murray Metal Fabricating, he called upon his sons to work in the summers rather than exploring the river all day. At about this time, Margot's mother began to put on makeup and disappear for hours in the afternoons. She always returned home at dusk, until one July evening when Margot found herself alone at the dock. Her oversized minnow net contained a giant puffball, white as the moon, bigger than her own head. Margot rose from the river, stood on the dock holding the skull-white mushroom, which she would slice and fry for dinner. The crane's little house was dark. When she turned on the kitchen light, she found the note on the table. She read and reread it, but could not crack its code. So many times Luann had said she could not bear living in this place, but there she had always been. Margot scratched her ankle and found a fat bloodsucker. She didn't have the patience to shrivel it with salt. Instead, she took a butcher knife, smashed the end of the wooden handle into the creature's head and twisted until the bloody pulp fell onto the kitchen tile. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Okay, I'm going to stand on my tippy toes. I'm Julie Dial. I proudly serve as the vice chair of the Humanities Montana, and I'm really happy to be here and happy that you all are here. Thank you. I met the most intriguing woman this weekend. She was funny, intense, compassionate, and confrontational. But the thing that really moved me, I saw her in a Missoula writer's workshop this afternoon, and I was moved by the intensity with which she paid attention. She paid attention to everybody in the room and everything in the room. It was amazing, and it was beautiful. Her name is Sheryl Noethe, and she was named Montana's fourth Poet Laureate in August of 2011. I was particularly struck by this statement: "A few words from an adult can shape a child's idea of who they are and who they will become." It was really cool because in the workshop, some of the kids were talking about the impact that Sheryl had had on them and how their perception had changed. It was really beautiful. Governor Schweitzer wrote in his appointment letter, "Your commitment to teaching children and that they have the ability to find their own literary voice is evidenced in your outstanding work in Montana schools." Noethe is co-founder of the Missoula Writing Collaborative and serves as its artistic director. And its heart, from what I could tell this afternoon. Noethe, over the past 17 years, under Sheryl's guidance, the collaborative has grown from a small program in a handful of Missoula schools to 15 residencies in Northwest Montana and over 1,500 children a year. Wow. Born and raised in Minnesota, Noethe attended a high school alternative program called Urban Arts, which allowed her to write poetry. She talked about that a little bit in the session and how much going to this school had changed her life. After winning the American Academy of Poets Award and a McKnight Fellowship, she published her first collection of poetry, The Descent of Heaven Over Lake. Now living at the foot of Mount Jumbo in Missoula, Noethe is a recipient of the National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship, a Montana Council Fellowship, the Cutbank Hugo Prize in Poetry, and the Emerging Voices Awards from New Rivers Press. She has also received an honorable mention for the Pushcart Prize. Her second poetry collection, The Ghost Openings, was awarded the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award and the William Stanford Poetry Prize. Wow. Her most recent collection, As Is, was published in 1909 by Lost Horses Press. It's an excellent book. I read it this afternoon. Excellent work. Her work has been included in numerous anthologies, including Poems Across the Big Sky, Montana Women Writers, A Geography of the Heart, and I Go to Ruined Places, Contemporary Poems in Defense of Global Human Rights. Please help me welcome Sheryl Noethe.
Don't egg me on. I've wanted to be up here since I was 11 years old. So this is huge. I want to thank the Committee for the Humanities because as poet laureate, you don't get paid. And I'm taking the Greyhound bus all over the state. And they're giving me car fare, hotels, and food. So I will survive this 2 years. I also want to dedicate my reading tonight to Ed Leahy, the great Noble Butte poet who passed this year, and to my husband, Robert Riella, who has kept me in shoes and clothing and hope and shelter for 25 years. So I'm going to start tonight with a poem. And thank you all for coming. It's great to have so many friends in Missoula. The Rock is Book. Do not look beneath the rock for gold or leach it with arsenic. The tribes tell us our mother is sick. Look at each rock as a book. See the forests of the earth at creation, from an altitude before number or measure. From above, you can see the basic shape of the organism, every organism. Think of the rock as a cookbook. From here, we can see the freeway's sickly concrete encroaching upon the lichen insidiously. Do you see the concentric circles, the continents of moss, made like us of calcium and iron from the stars? We are attached at the thought, inside my breath and your hearing. Are you there? We are not alone. We are bound. I say the word, you make the picture. Was she beautiful? Can you feel that we are bones, stones animated by breath, connected by air, language, and the invisible luminous umbilicus? Together we look at the gaping hole we have rent in the sky. I was beaten with objects when I was small. My mother was sick. She said not to make her start because we knew she couldn't stop. Are you there? Was she beautiful? I was redundant, elastic. I snapped back into place. And when I was big enough, I grabbed her fists, holding them in the air until she could no longer swing. I broke every yardstick in the house, every wooden spoon, spatula, hairbrush. Locked in the bathroom, it took firemen to climb up to get me out. For the first 12 years, I took it. I thought it was normal. When my friends denied they were beaten, I scorned them as liars. When I discovered the truth, I had the worst heartache ever. I have never grieved so hard or for so long. After the first death, Colette said, none of the others matter. I carry her rage in my bones, cracked in those beatings, grown together, vertebra grinding. When I am old, it will bend me over to look at the ground. Losing height, I wear high heels. This rock fused to bone, this book of my life, my body's story. Inside my breath and your hearing, you recoil at the word beating. Beating a child, your imagination sets to work. Are you still there? Are you listening? See the peeling linoleum with its burn marks? I used to cover them with my bare feet. See the father slipping away while she screams that she will see me in hell. We measure civilization's age in bones and stones and broken crockery. Our mother is sick, and our bones will fuse with the stones and the bowls. And yes, she was so beautiful. Thank you. I wanted to show Bonnie Jo my cover. And this has brought a lot of male readers, but it's also gotten me in trouble. I was in Helena reading at a school. The principal asked, I was evaluating a writer, and the principal asked if I would come and do a reading. And I said, yeah. So I had a room full of children, and I'm reading poems, and then one of the kids goes, "Can I look at your book cover?" And I went, yeah, okay. And I held it up, and the principal stood up and said, "You're dismissed, kids, go to recess." And then she told me, "Why'd you have to bring that thing?" So I was kicked out of a school in Helena, thanks to Lost Horse Press. Then I went on KECI. They said, "Bring a book." So I brought my book. They said, "Can you cover with your finger? Can you cover up her boobies?" And I didn't. I just held it up. The next poem that I'm going to read you is what got me this book deal. My publisher heard me reading this poem, and she asked me if I would like to make a book. Would I like to make a book? It's like, would I like to have your baby? Yes, I would. So this poem is called "No Exchange of Livestock." It took me 50 years and countless attempts to have normal sex. No booze, no sedatives, no chemical euphoriants, no alcoholic blackout, no disassociation, no dead drunk, no can't remember, or if I ever said no or stop, no broken marriages, no betrayal, no danger, no despair, no fixed silence, no blood, no infection, no lying, no secrets, no night terrors, no choking or gagging, no warnings, no threats, no suffocation, no more brothels, no money, no blood feud, no exchange of livestock, no force, no genital mutilation, no child brides, no angry God, no gang rape, no dawn to dusk curfew, no chattel, no vessel, no choice, no chance. And where was God? They say God saved the few he could, the rest, however, he kept. This is a poem that is from a story Ed Leahy told me, and it's called "What the Old Poet Heard." The villagers survived by burying their faces in the earth and breathing dirt, she told him. That summer day, he helped a Laotian woman reach higher apples on the tree, bees humming around them. She told him the first secret, how the war in her country was murderous, yet beautiful at once. During the fighting against the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, her people swung hazing blankets, its swarms of butterflies, suffocating the soldiers in an endless ocean of fluttering wings. He asked her, what could butterflies do to the enemy? She turned her head, graceful in all her gestures, like a lily in her stance, and she asked him, how many butterflies can you breathe for 1 minute and stay alive? How many butterflies for 2 minutes? For 3? Don't you hate it when writers get up there and rip through their stuff and go, God, this is no good, I didn't write this. Somebody came in during the night and they changed the words. I don't recognize any of this stuff. Okay, so I'm going to read, well, I'm not supposed to tell you beforehand if it's supposed to be funny, but it's too late. This is, this is supposed to be funny, okay. It's called Special Eds at Deaf School. Have you cleaned your hearing aids? Did you sharpen your pencils? Stop laughing. Don't bother him. Ignore him. Finish. Now, says the teacher, I'm going to write in your journals about myself, my family, what I like to do. Already the rabbit is at it, drumming his fingers at the back of his head. The next step will be high-pitched cries, eyelids pinkening and fluttering. Kyle is drawing elaborate, precise maps of every highway in the state of New York. Once when I tried to discuss his maps, the teacher told me, don't encourage it. Venu is drawing hundreds of chocolate chip cookies in his journal, a gift for his stout teacher, who hides boxes of them in her desk. Venu has another bad report for his file. Indeed, she talks. Her uncles, her aunts, her family's babies, locations, vacations, and the boys draw a blank. Kyle is finishing an impeccable map of Brooklyn. All right, she says, I'll make it easier for you. Just ask one question about me. The other boys have forgotten about writing in the journals. They are focused out the window in case a plane passes, and then they all shout and gesture, yelling, airplane, I hear it. Kyle, master cartographer with long bent fingers, they used to beat children for using sign instead of sitting on their hands, thus appearing to be perfect around perfect people, has no question for her. Her face is plum-colored. She yells at the deaf boys close up, her bulk a threat, and she shakes her fist. Bad do, she signs, bad do. Finally, Kyle understands and begins writing in his journal. The next morning, his teacher asks to see his question. Indeed, he has written one for her. Do you, he asks, have to go to the toilet? Reservation School. The poet asks the children to hold their breath and keep still. Eyes wide, hands covering mouths, they look around at each other, not wanting to break the moment until they gasp and laugh. Now, he says, write about the silence. Silence is a rock not moving in a lake, says the brown-haired fourth grader in a whisper. I nod, and a few children like that. They begin nodding their heads at beautiful thoughts. A little girl in braids with a waist as narrow as a wasp reads from her poem. Silence is a sad sob in the night. Wow, I say, oh man, could you repeat that? She shrugs, tosses off the line, which circles the room. A boy with a cut on his finger shakes it and puts it in his mouth. Silence is an empty jar in an old house. He shows me the hurt finger again. A little cowgirl stands and waits for quiet to say, silence is a window not opened. We smile tenderly at each other, nod. In this sudden outbreak of splendor, we are happy to be together. Finally, the boy who is working on his drawing says, silence is in a bottle and a basket. This is the end of class time, and everyone lines up to exchange high fives and congratulations. Silence is when my baby sister is asleep. Silence is cats wondering. I roll this afternoon around in my mouth, something sweeter than a ripe peach or custard. How close the soul can come to the skin when the body is still so new. This is a poem for Aung San Suu Kyi. not who he was. We are all of us, to a man, twins separated at birth. We must celebrate. This very moment has been waiting millions of years to arrive, and it found us here together, and it found us at war. Every soldier is someone's child. Monks face infantry rifles with open arms in a country where a nonviolent woman is imprisoned in a simple house which looks out onto a lake. When she steps outside, the crowds gather and the army stands guard. She reaches to hand a flower to a boy in uniform. Her serene gaze suggests the face of his mother, his sister, alive. Is it possible his father has survived? He drops his weapon, enchanted with the sensation that his face leans into a pale lily, pearlescent, numinous, a hidden source of light. He tries to bow, but she reaches out to stop him. Hope has outgunned the soldier, undone him, tipped his face to heaven. He sees her like the lit tip of a burning candle, white-hot eye of flame floating at the center. He watches her shimmer beside him. He feels warmed in the darkness. There is something that he thought was dead inside. He is not who he was, and more himself than ever before. The Boy Whose Last Name is a Poem in Itself. The administration doesn't understand. At 13, he's got nothing left to lose. They can't imagine what he's already seen. At a desk in the corner of the room, a smart kid, a small Indian boy, shy, a fast runner. There is no punishment like he's already endured. There are no threats life-threatening enough to get his attention. But he is going to finish his poem today. He sits down, looks at me, and listens, pencil in hand. The vice principal comes in and pulls him from the room. I follow behind, protesting. Why now? He writes for me. Another fight on the playground continued into the building. He got pummeled, as usual, and when pried off the other kid, screamed threats and curses through the halls. I asked them to punish him later, after school, not just now. It's out of your control, the teacher says. Sheryl, nobody likes a meddler. On the first day, I told him his name was a poem. Oh yeah, he said. And later I saw him writing it up and down the page in red marker, grabbed a thesaurus to add descriptive words to each letter, a poem born from his name. At home, he tends the smaller children. He's good, careful, patient, and kind. He makes a cat's cradle out of yarn, ties it around his father's wrists, gives it a pull, and the trap is sprung to a single thread, which he whips triumphantly in the air. He sets his baseball cap on the baby's head, and it falls over the toddler's laughing eyes. He is laughing, and it's the first time I've ever seen it. We're all laughing. He missed hearing the poem I read by Black Elk, the one about how the world moves in circles. I thought the poem could show him the deep faith in change and return. It was sad to teach the poem without him, especially imagining him languishing in detention. He is to sit in a chair in the cubicle for bad kids. He stretches out, reaches out his long, skinny legs and big feet in front of him. He is not in the least interested in what happens next. I imagine his mother weeping as she drives to pick him up. There have already been several serious meetings, and her eyes are sad when she talks about it. The single adult he's connected with, and now they've pulled him from my class. It's more important to focus on discipline than to give the kid a chance. Last week, a teacher said to me, you know, they punish those kids right into jail. I am a surfer in the snow, he writes, and I am most like a panda bear. Do the endangered recognize themselves? Well, I think it's been 20 minutes. Kim, has it been? One more? Oh, thank you, okay. because Kim told me she was going to get some kind of electronic thing that the reader would wear, and then she could zap them when they went over. But she's not going to try it on me tonight. This poem is called Resolution. Stop wanting. Stop waiting. No more shame. No blame. Sweep the house without remorse. Sing to the radio and forget the words. Defy grief. Take a twirl on the carpet. Pour water into a bowl without foreboding. Set it down. Make a sound. This is how to remember God. If we can't forgive, we keep an identity around our pain. And what suffers remains and is reborn. Maybe it looks like a hungry kid, a martyr, someone in a hood, a daughter run away again, another drunk abandoned brother. What suffers is reborn, older than civilization, fear of snakes, fear of falling, fire. God is in the machine, reaching and reaching. Try not to look at his hands. Helpless, sleeping body, one dimension or another, dreaming out of the prescribed lines. Animal mind, it thinks I can breathe underwater and that I can fly. Thank you very much. This is...
I'm Lois Welch, and I'm here to introduce Mary Blue, but I would first like to compliment the Dreams Work intern with the Montana Committee for the Humanities, who makes these little pieces of paper sometimes flutter down from the wings. Since I'm introducing myself, I should perhaps say, since I don't know who's out there, that I taught at the university for 120 years, and this is why they've asked me to introduce Mary Blue. Reading Mary's latest book, This Is Not the Ivy League, I started piecing together her intellectual biography. I've known Mary for years, at book fests here, conferences at Northern Montana College and in Idaho, at various luxurious board meetings. As I read about her academic life, unexpected details intersected mine. Dean Maureen Clough, Professor Margaret Ephron at UM. Bigger patterns, underfunded libraries, crazy administrators, conferences. Her tales of being the only woman in the English department mimic mine. We too at UM had a professor who was always saying in reverent tones to his students, "When I was at Yale." Only at UM we didn't retort, "This is not the Ivy League." My colleagues retained some tiny delusion that we might be Ivy League West, not Bush League. Now piece together, I said. In her wonderful 1993 essay on the art of the memoir, Mary compares memoir writing to quilting, that is, to the art of piecing together scraps into something beautiful and useful. Now, Mary's somebody who gets up at 5:30 in the morning to quilt a couple of hours before heading off to teach. In this, I am not her double. She recommends cutting scraps of cloth into, say, the tiny petal shape you would be using for your quilt. You cut them into shape as the scraps turn up. Then you put them in a 3-pound coffee can until it's full. When you're ready, you take the pile and sort them into colors to arrange the pattern for your quilt, and then hand sew them together bit by bit with teensy stitches until you have a whole wondrous design. I've seen her quilts. She even gave us one which graces our bed to this day. I've read her books. She writes at least as well as she quilts. When I read This Is Not the Ivy League, it was precisely this quilt aspect of the book that struck me. She explores the 18 years she spent teaching at Northern Montana College. It's less chronological than thematic, a yellow chapter, a blue one, and like that, organized around issues of cultural assumptions about what girls should learn and how one tells one's life and to whom, about dealing with crises and crazy people and turmoil inside and outside of academia. It's really a smart search for pattern, for significance in the chaos of a busy life. Mary Clearman Blue is as authentically Montanan as huckleberry jam. A ranch girl, hungry to read, her pages on learning to read as a child are dazzling. She was an ambitious girl hungry for experience, a determined girl for whom a PhD and an academic career are the north point on her compass, with family and loved ones occupying the other compass points. Many of you already know that Mary grew up on family ranches in the Lewistown area. She attended UM during the Fiedler era, even took classes from him. She married early, pursued a PhD, landed a job at Northern Montana College in 1969, going on to become the English department chair, then a dean. Losing her deanship, she took up the fiction she'd been writing years before, moved to Idaho in 1987, where she first taught at Lewis Clark College, then at the University of Idaho, where she teaches now. Mary's first collection of stories, Lambing Out, was published in 1977. Since then, she's published 3 more collections of stories, 5 books of nonfiction, and edited an anthology of women's writing with her colleague Kim Barnes. She's the winner of a Western Heritage Award and the Western Literature Association's Distinguished Achievement Award. Twice she won Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award, once in fiction, once in nonfiction. Would you please join me in welcoming the distinguished Mary Blue?
It is such an honor to be back in Missoula. The last time I read at the Gala reading must have been 10 or 15 years ago. And I read first, and the other person who read was James Welch, and I felt so honored. And tonight I feel so honored to read on the Gala stage with Bonnie Jo and with Sheryl. Thanks to everybody at the Idaho at Humanities Montana, especially Ken Egan and Kim Anderson, who have been friends for years, and thank all of you for coming. The cover of my book shows what was once Northern Montana College and now is MSU Northern. I was in a panel yesterday on memoir over at the Holiday Inn, and after the panel was over, a man came up to me and introduced himself. I would never have recognized him, but he was a student of mine from those days. And I said, "Did you recognize anybody?" And he said, "I recognized everybody." This book might be subtitled The Education of a Montana Ranch Girl and Her Subsequent Attempts to Educate Other Ranch Kids. And I thought I would read something from fairly early in the book where my little sister and I are sent to a rural school. We'd been homeschooled up until the time she was 5 and I was almost 9 for reasons having to do with distance and bad roads. And so here goes. Excuse me. By the time my little sister and I enrolled in the Duck Creek School in 1949, a lot of ranch country had changed. For one thing, the terrible drought years of the 1920s and the Depression of the 1930s had ended the hopes of thousands of young homesteaders who lost their farms and ranches to debt and foreclosure. Montana lost a third of its population during those years and over half of its rural schools. Then came World War II, and another population shift, giving rural teachers like my favorite aunt the chance to move over to Washington State and earn twice the salary without having to shovel coal and carry water. Rural school boards searched high and low, but if they couldn't find a teacher, the school had to close. Not that I understood anything about history or economics, but I did overhear some of the anxious conversation. Have you found a teacher yet? No, have you? But the day came when my little sister and I, decked out in new dresses hand-sewn by my mother and equipped with a new lunchbox to share and new tablets and pencils and crayons, were driven up the precarious dirt road from the ranch and over several miles of graveled road to the Duck Creek School. September in Montana can be dry and mild, and I remember our introduction to Duck Creek as very pleasant. The school was fresh from its fall cleaning, and the American flag floated from its pole, and the windows had been opened to the familiar odors of ripening wheat and creek water. So many novelties to experience: a hallway with hooks for our coats and a Red Wing cooler that held drinking water, the long school room with rows of desks in graduated sizes, the portraits of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln on the wall above the teacher's desk, and most enticing of all, a 3-shelf bookcase that was the school's library. Including my sister and me, 9 pupils were enrolled in the Duck Creek School that day. The 3 Anderson girls who rode horseback down from their father's remote ranch in the foothills and stabled their horses in the ramshackle barn. Buzzy Huffine, a large and good-natured 7th grader, Louise Snap and her brother Billy, who were attending the Duck Creek School because their parents hadn't been able to find a teacher for their school, and Dixie Grover, who would be a 1st grader with my sister. We all clattered around to decide which desks best accommodated our summer's growth of arms and legs, and I enjoyed stowing my new tablet and crayons in my desk, and at noon, sitting outside the school in one of the clanging swings to drink milk out of a thermos and trade sandwiches with Louise Snap. There were other pleasures. Games at recess that involved kicking cans or choosing up sides and running back and forth with sticks from the woodpile. Taking turns carrying the water bucket across the gravel road in front of the school, over the stile, and down the road to the spring in the cow pasture to fetch back water to pour into the Red Wing cooler. I knew that my favorite aunt had taught at the Duck Creek School in the dim past. She'd actually taught the oldest Anderson girl as a 1st grader, but I didn't know that she had noted in her diary the days she had followed that same trail through the cow pasture to clean that same spring. I hadn't grasped the unspoken family assumption that I would follow in her and my mother's footsteps and teach in my own country school someday. But I was changing. The days when I thought of myself in 3rd person were long past. Wary of ridicule from listening adults, I no longer told myself out loud what I was thinking. I was on the cusp of a new awareness, seeing the world through my own eyes and no one else's, and my eyes were on that case of unread books. I wouldn't stop until I had finished every single book, and then I would start reading them over again. Those days at Duck Creek sometimes seem as close and immediate and clear as the glass of those tall schoolhouse windows that looked across the trampled grass of the schoolyard to the graveled road angling north toward the Judith Mountains and eventually fading out of sight. The schoolroom itself was like a capsule in which routines were repeated day after day, and nothing exciting ever happened, except the day the stubble field on the other side of the schoolyard caught fire, and one of the Anderson girls jumped on her horse and tore off to get help from a neighbor, while the teacher and Buzzy Huffine beat back the flames with shovels and sacks. In the capsule of the schoolroom with its pine wood floors and interlocking desks with lids that lifted over the clutter of our workbooks, we scratched away with the steel pens that were passed out at penmanship time and breathed the fumes of real ink. We lived in the present with little suspicion of a future and no sense of the past except as anything but remote. We didn't know that we were the last generations of children to dip our steel pens into little bottles of reeking ink and practicing slants and ovals on lined paper, according to the Palmer message, with admonitions from the teacher not to draw our ovals, lest our fingers form writer's cramp, but to keep our hands and wrists motionless and move our pens by rotating our forearms on our desks. As we obediently dipped our pens and rotated our forearms, we were anachronisms ranging in age from 5 to 17, but we didn't know it. Our teacher that first year was a short-tempered redhead who drove out from Lewistown on Monday mornings, spent the week in the teacherage behind the schoolroom, and drove back to Lewistown on Friday afternoons to spend the weekend with her husband. Neighborhood gossip had it that she was teaching to keep ahead of his gambling debts. I can't remember any of the lessons she taught, although I do remember her scolding me for reading too fast or not reading closely. I was watching your eyes. They weren't moving back and forth across the lines. Read it again. She was right about the way my eyes moved on the page. I had taught myself to read in a kind of sweep, in the literary equivalent of bolting my food. I had been tested that summer by the county superintendent of schools so she could decide what grade I should be placed in, although discovering I was reading at a 12th grade level and doing arithmetic at a 3rd grade level couldn't have been much help to her. It didn't matter to me when I was placed in 4th grade with 2 of the Anderson girls and Billy Snap. They couldn't keep up with me. I finished what I was assigned, and then I reread one of the 70 or so books that made up the school library, or I sat and drew pictures, or I entertained myself with my elaborately imagined stories that spun through my head like an alternative life I was living. The redheaded teacher was the least of my worries. I now suspect that I was the least of hers. If I wasn't going to pay attention to what she was trying to teach me, she may have decided I wasn't worth the bother. She hadn't wanted my little sister and me in her school in the first place. Like Louise and Billy Snap, we belonged in another district, except that in our case, our assigned school was situated on the other side of the Judith River with no bridge for miles. But there we were in the Duck Creek School, and there was the redheaded teacher, and when my 5-year-old sister threw up because the teacher yelled at her for forgetting the words on the page, she gave up on my sister too. It wasn't until my sister started in a Lewistown school in the middle of 4th grade that anyone realized she had never learned to read at all. Thanks to my valiant rancher grandmother, who drilled and drilled me, I learned the multiplication tables and I learned to spell. My rancher grandmother also cared deeply about the doings of people like Coronado and Cortez and De Soto and De Leon, and she tried to interest me in the string of firsts they seemed to have run up, like discovering the Mississippi River in the Fountain of Youth, but in that project, she was never successful. My sister and I attended the Duck Creek School for 3.5 years. A well-meaning little woman with 2 sons of her own had followed the redheaded woman as our teacher, but it was during that final half year that we learned just how strange school could be. It had looked as though we wouldn't find a teacher for that year at all. And then, hallelujah, at the last possible minute, a neighboring ranch wife said she'd take the school. She'd been very ill. She wasn't sure she could do it, but yes, she thought she could. Everyone was very pleased. She was said to have been an excellent teacher before her illness. Years later, I wrote a short story about those few months with the teacher I called Mrs. Scarta. And when the story was published in the Georgia Review, my sister and brother-in-law read it. She had to have made it up. Those things couldn't have happened, said my brother-in-law. Oh, yes, they did, said my sister. Oh, yes, they did. Mrs. Scarta, as I'll continue to call her, was a bird-boned little woman with an anxious face and eyes that searched our faces for reassurance, as she told us how glad she was to be well again and how much she looked forward to spending the year with us. We were a depleted little group. The oldest Anderson girl had turned 18 and given up on schooling, and Buzzy and his mother had moved to town after his father died, and the Snaps, miraculously, had found a teacher for their school. So only the other 2 Andersons and 2 new first graders, a little girl I'll now call Jill, who seemed to have a bladder infection, and a little boy whom I called Forby in my short story. All of us except Jill and Forby were surprised when Mrs. Scarta didn't assign us schoolwork, but instead began a rambling monologue from which she said she hoped we learned more than we would from lessons. What she wanted us to know was that she had enemies. There had been professors when she was in college. The director of a theater group she had belonged to, a man who had taught her niece so badly in a city school, her sister-in-law. It turned out that her father-in-law had been dying of cancer. Mrs. Scarta's voice shook as she told us how cancer had its own terrible smell, so putrid and horrible that only she, of the whole family, could bear to sit in the same room with him. Others in the family, she said, didn't really care he was dying. At this point, Jill flung herself out of her seat and tore through the schoolroom, banging doors behind her on the way to the outhouse. Mrs. Scarta went on talking about her father-in-law. Her voice trembled. I sat up with him all night. I held his hand. No one else would stay with him. He died about 3 o'clock in the morning. Do you know that dead bodies fart? We sat in rapt silence, all but Forby, who was coloring with his black crayon. As the fall grew chillier and the oil stove had to be lit, Mrs. Scarta grew fearful. After a few days of ordinary lessons, her eyes searched the classroom and came to rest on the stove. If it exploded, it would kill us all. Her voice broke the silence, and we all looked up, blinking in the sunlight that strained through the frosted windows, all but Forby, that is, who kept coloring with his black crayon. My desk is on the far side of the room, and they might be able to identify my body, but most of you would be mutilated beyond recognition. If it exploded, I'd jump up and run, said one of the Anderson girls. You wouldn't have time to run, said Mrs. Scarta. For the rest of the week, we watched the oil heater and breathed as tentatively as we could. Mrs. Scarta, however, had begun to worry about Jill, who continued to punctuate her runs to the outhouse with slammed doors. She's been wetting her panties, said Mrs. Scarta. I can smell her. Slam went another door behind one of Jill's desperate dashes. Bang, bang, Mrs. Scarta shouted at the slammed door. There go the British. We never knew what became of Jill. She simply stopped attending school. It's possible that Mrs. Scarta complained to her parents, or more likely to the neighbors who had hired her parents for fall work. Or maybe Jill told her parents what was happening, or maybe not. Maybe her family just moved away. When I look back over those years, I'm struck by how little any of us told our parents about what was happening at school. We chattered at home about who said what smart thing on the playground and what smart thing got said back, but we didn't tell that my sister threw up when the redheaded teacher yelled at her, or that the redheaded teacher once sneaked up behind me and pummeled me with her fists for no reason I ever knew, and we didn't tell about Mrs. Scarta until long after the fact. Did our complicit silence grow out of our sense of the schoolroom as a capsule in which we were suspended from the day-to-day of the rest of the world? As I reread my short story, I'm struck by what I kept of the facts and what I changed. My own role in the Forby episode, for example. Because after Jill vanished, Mrs. Scarta turned her attention on Forby. There's something the matter with him, she whispered to the rest of us. Why does he always color with a black crayon? Forby kept coloring, and Mrs. Scarta's worries grew. If he were ever to lose control, it would take more than any one of us to subdue him, she confided in her troubled whisper. The insane have strength beyond all normal measures. That's what I'm afraid of, that he'll snap and overpower us all. By this time, every pair of eyes in school was glued on Forby. Could we possibly have believed the child was insane? I only know that Forby gradually looked up from his crayons to find a wall of suspicion around him. At recess, he was no longer chosen on anyone's side in games. He took to hovering at a distance of a few yards, pawing with his overshoes at the sod. Get away, somebody might bellow across a few yards of prairie grass at uncomprehending Forby in his thick coat and cap. Get away from us. Go away. From the first, Forby made no defense, withdrawing more deeply into himself when we darted at him, threatening. How long did our bullying go on? Could it have been for days? And what part did I play What am I masking from myself by my use of the collective we, my sheltering in our tiny group? I do remember that the day Forby finally broke and ran, I ran after him with everybody else, and just as we saw we were going to corner him by the barbed wire fence that separated the schoolyard from the neighboring grain field, Forby flung himself on that fence and set the wires vibrating for yards. At that precise moment, Forby's mother showed up. She broke into a run with her coat flapping around her legs, plucked Forby off the barbed wire, and carried him back toward the school. Here my memory darkens. I cannot see Forby lolling on her shoulder as she opens the door of the school. I cannot see her carrying him to her car. Her arrival seemed to me at the time as just one more unlikely event. Was it a complete non sequitur, or had she gotten wind of the bullying and come to look into it? I do know that I was 11, and the Anderson girls probably 12 and 14, old enough to know we shouldn't have been picking on a 6-year-old. In my short story, my point of view character is a revision of myself as Forby's prime persecutor, whose motive is to win Mrs. Scarta's approval. I can gloss my revision by telling the story of a scapegoat, or I can ponder the story I was avoiding, because at the time, the last thing on my mind was Mrs. Scarta's approval. In retrospect, I realized that growing between us was a perverse flower of antagonism that I would feel toward various teachers and professors, even through graduate school. Mrs. Scarta and I argued about the interpretation of stories in school readers. We argued about the correct position of one's fingers on piano keys. I was taking piano lessons from the redoubtable Miss Pennick in Lewistown, who insisted on a certain finger curvature and wrist position that Mrs. Scarta considered unnecessary and ungraceful. We argued about the significance of ancient Mayan human sacrifice. A detail I retained in my short story was that she lent me a book on the topic that gave me nightmares. Mouthy and obnoxious, that was me, or at least how Mrs. Scarta probably saw me. Our days at Duck Creek were coming to an end. The first winter blizzard hit just as my parents began the move from the ranch on the river to the ranch they had bought in the foothills of the Snowy Mountains, close enough to Lewistown that my sister and I, and our new little sister, 10 years younger, could attend town schools and eventually go to high school without having to board away from home. What with the perils of bad roads and blowing snow and the uncertainties of starting over, my father and mother would have had more on their minds than Mrs. Scarta and the shadows only she perceived. But I missed a day or two of school toward the end of that last term, and my little sister uncharacteristically came home with a story about Mrs. Scarta, who had gathered her dwindling little flock about her and told them that Mary hated her. "But you," she smiled through her tears, hugging my sister, "you're so sweet. You'd do anything for me." The Duck Creek School couldn't have stayed open for another year or two, if that. For a long time it sat empty by the side of the road, its long row of windows filmed with dust, until somebody hauled it off to use as a granary. Mrs. Scarta got a job teaching in an elementary school in a small town and won a Teacher of the Year award. The youngest Anderson girl gave high school a try and dropped out after a few months. Forby grew up to farm his father's land. Jill might as well have dropped off the face of the earth, so far as any of us ever knew. A 4th grade teacher in Lewistown spotted my sister's illiteracy and taught her to read. I started high school with a curious assortment of knowledge and skills, the multiplication tables, an unwilling suspicion that De Soto, De Leon, Cortez, and Coronado really mattered, and the ability to read faster than anyone my teachers had ever encountered, and found in those teachers a whole new set of assumptions about what a girl ought to learn and how she ought to learn it. Several years ago, my sister and I detoured off the highway, now a paved road, and visited the granary that had once been the Duck Creek School. It tilted off its foundation with its desk still bolted to its hardwood floor, and a clutter of forgotten primers and workbooks discarded in the chaff. My sister picked up one of the readers as a keepsake, then changed her mind, laid it back down on the floor, and took a few pictures instead. It seemed the right thing to do. Those pictures show us in our bright summer clothing, a couple of aliens and a dusty time capsule. And yet that time capsule, lopsided and askew, once had been solid and real and eternal. Mrs. Scarta was right. We had learned a great deal at Duck Creek that had nothing to do with lessons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, lovers of literature. We've done it again, 12 years. I want to let you know to save your dance card next year. It'll be the same weekend, October 7th through the 9th. You'll be hearing from us. And I want to give this final message. There are 3 legs that make this possible and give us all heart about our world and our future. The incredible generosity of the artists who come, the authors who come and share every year with us, the amazing audiences who I have seen for 2.5 days here, and I thank you so much. And the third leg is that there are books in the lobby. Please go out to the lobby, buy these 3 amazing books. We've got fiction, poetry, and memoir. What more could you want? And have them signed by the authors. And thank you all so much.